Hey guys, Anonymity here. This is going to be the first Diamond Hunt 3 user script tutorial, and I decided it would be a good idea to go over one of my simplest scripts that I've already done, which is the Brighter Kills script. So all it does is, in the monster log, you can see how the kill count here is very dark, at least on my monitor, and in order to see it I usually have to just highlight it. Now, all I really want to do is make this brighter. So the first thing we want to do is a little bit of research. In this case, there's not much to do really. We just want to see basically what color or where the color is. So I'm just going to right click and inspect and take a look at this element. Now you'll see it has a style attribute here with the color in hex here. And all I really want to do is make this brighter. Now, you can experiment with different colors. I already had done that in the past, so I know that silver is much better. So if I make that silver, you can see that's definitely much better there. I don't even have to highlight it to see it. Alright, so let's jump over to the Tamper Monkey dashboard. Now, if you're working on a script that already exists in this list, just find it and then click on the edit button here on the right side. For this case, we're going to click on make a new script, which is this little plus icon here. And that'll bring up the editor. Now, this should more or less be what you see when you first create it. These values here will be a little bit different, but I'm going to go over what each of those means. So the first one is the name, and this is just the name of your script. This will affect what the URL to your script looks like, what users will see when they go to the script's main page, and things like that. The namespace is kind of a way to identify either a particular script or group of scripts. Now, coming from a Java background, I kind of do this package name type of convention here, where it's just your domain backwards and more detailed descriptions as you go to the right from there. But you could put whatever you want here. You could put your username or your website or something like that. So the version represents, well, obviously what version your script is, and it controls things like automatic updates for your users and that sort of thing. Now, it's a good practice to use something called semantic versioning, which you can look up online for more detail, but the basic idea is this. It's split into three numbers that go major, minor, and build, and so the build or the rightmost number is basically for minor, like very minor changes that, aren't really noticed that much. Might be minor bug fixes, small changes, that sort of thing. If you're going to make a change that could potentially affect the user, but it's not like an entire feature rewrite or something, you want to do the second number, and that's called the minor version. Just increment that. And when you increment one number, everything to the right should be reset to 0. And then if you want to do something huge, like maybe it's a whole new set of features, or you do a complete rewrite or something like that, you would do the leftmost number and increment that by 1, and that's called the major version number. So the author is pretty self-explanatory. You just put your name there. And then the match is just the website or a wildcard version of a website that the script is going to be enabled on. Now for DH3, all of the scripts are going to be with this URL, so just put that there. For Grant, this just gives your scripts specific permissions, and for Diamond Hunt we're not really going to need that, but if for some reason you find that you do, just look up online what you need to put here. Otherwise, just put the word none, and that just means that we don't have any special permissions that we need. Alright, so let's start doing some actual coding. The first thing I'm going to do is kind of set up a template that I usually use for when I start a script. And you'll see this $sign a lot, and usually when you see that, that means I'm doing something with jQuery, which is automatically included with Diamond Hunt. So if you just pass the jQuery object a function, it's basically going to run that once the document is fully loaded. And if you've ever used something like document already, it's the same thing as that, just the jQuery way of doing it. So this init is going to be a function I'm going to create, and I usually create an init function just to separate out kind of the initialization logic from any other functions that I'm going to have in here. It's also useful because there's some scripts that you don't want to begin until the player is actually logged in and loaded. So a lot of people will do something where basically they'll say if not var username. So basically if the username variable is not set yet, we're going to return, and we're going to, I don't know, set timeout init 1000. So what this does is, if the username is not set yet, call this function again in 1 second, and then immediately return, and that'll skip any of the logic after this. And then once the variable var username is set, it'll bypass this if statement and actually do the init logic there. So what we need to do here is figure out how we can access these kill count sections here. Now, if you click on what you're interested in the console down here, you'll see this kind of list of elements on the bottom here. And this is the kind of selector information that we're interested in. Basically, it goes all the way from the element that you have selected up every ancestor to all the way up to the HTML element. So the first one that has a unique ID is this combat log section here. And what we're going to want to do is first select on that, and then basically find a unique path down to each of these spans here. So let's start at this div here, and we can see that each div within there is one of the monster sections here. So if we open up the first one, see there's a table in there, table body, and then a bunch of table rows, and we'll see that the section with the kill count is actually within the first row. So what we're going to do is first go to the ID, then go to the table, and then go to the first table row here. So let's copy this and go over here for reference. So if you send a string to the jQuery object, it's going to basically accept a CSS selector, and that will let you specify what kind of elements you want. Now, if you were doing a direct ancestor, you would use this key, but since we're doing more than one layer at a time, we're just going to go from here, find any table within that element, and then within that table, we're going to find any table row. But in particular, we're curious about the first element, so first child is going to select any table row that is the first child of its parent. So next thing, sorry if there's some background noise, my dishwasher just went on. So next we look at the first table row here, and go in here, and there's two table data elements, and it looks like the first one is where the kill count will be. We'll go in here and keep opening it up, and we get to the span. So what we need next is the first TD and then the span, and then that should get us to where we need. So again, TD, first child, and then the span. So in future videos, I probably won't go over the long tedious task of finding the right element like this, but for the first video, I think it's good to go over it so you have an idea of how to do that. So next I'm going to take this bit of code and I'm going to actually copy this into the browser console. And I want to make sure that this is selecting what I want it to and not anything else, and also that it's getting all of the elements. So I reset the colors to the default here just to make sure. And we're going to go .css, and there's a color, and silver. So this is just a jQuery method that will set a CSS key value pair to the elements in the selection. So we do that, and they all changed to silver, which is exactly what we want, and it doesn't look like anything else was changed, so that's perfect. Now here's the interesting part. If I get out of this menu, go to a different tab, and then come back and go back to the monster log, you'll see that all the colors are dark again. Now this is what I was talking about before when I said it's not going to be as simple as just changing the color one time. And the reason it behaves this way is because all of this content is dynamically generated from the server every time you click on monster log. So what we have to do now is see what happens when you actually click on this monster log button. So if you right click and go to inspect, it'll jump to that element, and we're looking for the click event. So you see this on click here. It calls this function called clicks item, and this is one of the diamond hunt functions that gets called anytime you click on an item box here. So we're going to want to override this method to do some custom logic. So back over to the code, and inside the init function, we'll just move this down and use that for later. So we're going to want to get a reference to the current clicks item function. So we'll just say const original clicks item clicks item. And the reason we want a reference to the original one is because when we override it, we don't want to change the existing functionality, we just want to add to it. So our new function is basically going to wrap the old one, call the old one, and then add our logic afterwards. So what we're going to do is overwrite the window.clicksitem function to be a new function. And we're going to, inside this function, we're going to call the original one, but we're going to use this apply function on that function, which basically lets you take, give it this object and a list of arguments, and applies that to the function. So if you're going to overwrite something, this is the proper way to do it. In case you're not aware, the arguments variable inside of a function is just an array of all of the arguments that were passed to that function. Now, if you remember, this clicks item sends a string called combat log here to that function. So we only want to trigger our logic if the first variable here, which we'll just call A for now, is equal to that. So if A is equal to combat log, we will do our special logic. And for now, let's put this in here, and .css, color, and silver. I just realized I messed something up here. This should be window dot, otherwise it's going to look in the local scope and it doesn't exist. So just make sure you put the window there. Okay, so if we go over to the game again and refresh, wait for it to load. Okay, now if we go to combat log, we'll see that the color is not changed, but it did log the combat log here. Now, the reason for that is that once this bit is loaded in, it takes a little while before it's actually loaded into the page. So, while this executes immediately, it's not actually there yet. This is something that exists for the combat log, but isn't really a problem in most other parts of the game. So, just keep in mind if you're trying to do something and it's for some reason just not working, it could be some silly edge case like this. Now, the way I get around this is kind of a hacky method, and I'm sure there's a better way to do it. But essentially what I do is I create a function that waits for those elements to exist, and then once it exists, I just set the color a few times at different intervals. So we're going to create a function called wait until visible, and we're going to take this selector here, put it? Something called L, which just stands for elements or elements. And then if L dot length is greater than 0, so this basically means if this has selected at least one element, that's going to be the case that they're now visible. Otherwise, we're going to basically call this function again in, I don't know, say 50 milliseconds or something like that. Just wait 50 milliseconds. Now, we don't want this to happen forever, so the way we can prevent this is by creating a variable called calls, and this could be like the maximum number, say 40 calls, and then every time this function is called, we just decrement that, and if the calls is greater than 0, we do this. Otherwise, we'll just stop, and they'll have to deal with the dark color. Probably will never happen, but it could. So what I'm going to do here is, if those spans exist, I'm going to take what we were doing before with the CSS here, and apply that to L here. Now, with some testing in the past, I noticed that this doesn't always work. So the way I got around that is I basically just called it a couple extra times with the delay, just to make sure it actually does what it's supposed to do. So I did one with 500 milliseconds, just half a second, and you have to redo the selector because it could have changed. So put that there, and then .css, and then do it again a little bit later. So it looks like I forgot to make this an actual function. Put that there, and then we actually would need to call this at least once to get started. Save that, and now we can test it out. So if we refresh, so now if we click on the combat tab, go to monster log, you'll see that the colors are silver.